Welcome to Planetary Gig Talk, Tales of Music and Magic. I'm your host, Jefferson Glassy, Chief Spiritual Dude of the Planetary Gig Society, whose mission is creating unity through music, but also, as I like to say, making connections through music with the intention of bringing peace. And today, we are nowhere near Studio One of the worldwide headquarters of the Planetary Gig Society, but even in a much better spot. Outside Nashville, Tennessee, at Wooten Woods, here at Victor Wooten's Spirit of Music Camp, under the pavilion, outside in nature, and I am very, very pleased and honored and privileged to have what amounts to sort of a fulfillment of desire, the opportunity to talk with a great musician, really smart, wonderful, compassionate guy, Stephen J. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. It's fabulous.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So I sort of found out about you. You've been in the music biz playing with Weird Al Yankovic since 1981, I guess, right?
That's right.
And I'm sort of embarrassed I didn't know about that, but hey, you were here last year at Spirit of Music Camp with your sons and played some music and talked about some really amazing stuff involving rhythm and pitch, which we can get into. And I've been sort of following you and seeing your writings and hearing more about you, and I'm just really so happy to be here talking with you. I'd like to ask a little bit about, I know that when you were in your 20s or so, you went to Africa, but before that, when or how did music come into your life? Did your parents play? There were brothers or sisters or nobody? Was there music in your house? Did you start with piano or start with lessons or in school or choir? Or how did music tap you on the shoulder, from the get-go there?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be born into a musical family. Mm-hmm. My mom, Delphine J., was a singer and a pianist in Detroit. She sang with opera companies. And my dad was a home musician. He played banjo and accordion and harmonica. He'd sit around at night. He was a pharmacist. When he'd come home from work, he'd sit around at night playing music. And my older sister, Ellen, was a guitarist. She had a guitar that I could practice on. And my younger brother, Mike, was very into music, but more from the technological aspect. Mm-hmm. But anyway, growing up in that environment where music was paramount, my mother never really cared too much about my report cards, but she always cared deeply about my music.
Wow, that would be a good thing for a lot of people, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I did okay in school, but the emphasis was always on the creative aspect. And I guess I think I first decided to become a musician when I was about 5 years old, watching her play and getting lost, particularly in Clair de Lune, the Debussy piece. I can still remembering that thousands of times, that moment when I stood there and I saw her wrapped in ecstasy and in another world. And I decided I wanted to go there. You have to forgive me because talking about my mom right now is a little difficult.
I'm sorry, she passed this year.
Yeah, in April.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, she had a long, beautiful life, and she was always a great inspiration. But anyway, that's the thing that first really moved me, was watching her play, and then likewise watching my dad play. It just seemed like the place I wanted to go in my life.
Wow.
And then particular pieces of music like Clair de Lune, and later on Rite of Spring, really set my chickens free.
Wow.
When I first heard Rite of Spring, I was aghast. I didn't know music could do that. I didn't know music could take you there, And I figured, wow, okay, now I know. We can go to the moon with this stuff. Anything is possible.
Uh-huh.
Then later on, equally important was hearing Bitches Brew. once again, I was just totally dumbfounded. Like he had shown us another planet and a whole other universe that we could go to in music. And so I was even more, dedicated and cemented into it.
Did you start off when you were, at that age 5 or so
Yeah.
with piano or
Yes,
guitar? Or what?
since my mom was a piano teacher, she basically handcuffed me to the piano at age 5, which kind of backfired because after a while I didn't feel like playing piano too much,
Yeah. Sometimes that can happen when the parents are...
Yeah, but it got me started and it got the groundwork there, and
Yes.
I learned a lot of things that were very important to who I am, starting that early, and I can't thank her enough for that. But I remember when my kids, Miles and Ian, were little, and we decided to give them piano lessons. My wife Barbara said, "Okay, well, if we're going to pay for piano lessons, you guys have to practice a half an hour a day." And I instantly said, "No, no, 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 no.
Ooh.
Never, ever practice unless you want to."
That's
Never.
very wise.
Yeah, I said, and well, I'll get back to that in a second because there was another line to that statement, but it seemed to me like music was more like eating ice cream, and if somebody says, "Oh, you like ice cream? Well, if we're going to buy it, you have to eat a bowl a day." Kind of doesn't understand the nature of fun and attraction and what we're doing it for.
Yeah.
So I told my kids when they were little, I said, never practice unless the spirit moves you and you want to practice. First of all, because there's a lot of other people out there who love to practice, and when you grow up, you can go and watch their concerts. At which point, a little something clicked in their heads, like, well, to heck with that. We want to be the ones on stage. We don't want to go watch concerts.
Yeah.
Just necessarily watch them.
Right.
We want to be in them. So that moved them. And then I said also, if you force yourself to practice, you could turn into the kind of a musician, or what people call a musician. Unfortunately, sometimes we see it at certain phases of musicians' lives where there's really no music, no matter how many notes they play. They're battling with something inside themselves, and it's some sort of evolution they're going through, but it doesn't result in music. You know how many times you've seen that happen, where somebody is making lots of notes and lots of sounds, and there's no music anywhere to be found. So I told them those two things, and from that moment on, we could not get them to stop practicing.
They just love playing.
Yeah, once I told them it's totally optional, then all we had to do was just beg them to stop once in a while.
So how long were you practicing, or I guess taking lessons from your mother?
Yeah.
For a few years, 5 years?
Well, I guess I forget exactly how many years, but I remember when I got to be about 10, my sister Ellen's guitar attracted me, and I picked it up and started plunking around on that, and that's where I got into lutes and fretted instruments. And, well, you know how good that feels. Once you start it,
I know.
You can't stop. So from there, I guess when I was 13, a friend of mine was starting a band, and he said, "Can you think of a name for my band?" And I said, "No, but do you need anybody?" And he said, "Yeah, we need a bass player." So I said, cool, I can do that. So I took...
There you
At
go.
that point, and this was in Orlando, Florida, they had youth centers. Every high school had a youth center. And every Friday and Saturday night, their different bands would play at the different youth centers: Orlando, Winter Park, Maitland, Winter Haven, Ocala. So there's a real circuit where the young teenage bands could play. And I joined this band, but I didn't have a bass. All I had was my sister's acoustic guitar. And so I went to the gigs and sat on a stool and played with the guitar on my knee and pressed the body of the guitar against my ear so I could hear what I was playing. And I made up bass parts to the songs, in my own little world, and no one could hear me but myself. And this continued for a couple of months when my dad, Eugene J., took pity on me and took me down to Sears and bought me one of those Silvertone basses with the amp in the case.
Nice.
But I'm always thankful for that interim period where I didn't have an instrument that anyone could hear but me. And I could sit on there on the stage in front of an audience and play parts and figure out how bass parts work. I couldn't really make a mistake because no one could hear me, so it was this sort of like being a ghost.
But you did have some training and some ear from playing piano.
Oh, yeah. And I also had some training and some ear from appreciating bass parts. Listening to I guess the year I started playing with this band was the year that Louie Louie came out.
Louie.
Yeah. And about 6 months later, the Beatles hit the scene.
Ooh.
And I was...
watershed moment.
Yeah, well, we watched that first Ed Sullivan performance with my church youth group, and I watched my sister just lose her everything, and I watched everybody just going like superhumans in terms of their feeling and emotion, and then that really, really moved me, as it did everyone in that magical moment, which later we got to play on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert on that very same stage at the Ed Sullivan Theater where that happened.
Awesome.
And that was Goosebump City.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was at that point that I started really noticing and really digging bass parts. Like, I'd love the song, but I'd love how I could isolate the bass and just feel the, boom, 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 boom. I was like really, really attracted to it. And it wasn't long after that I was there playing bass. So I already had this affinity for those kinds of parts, the parts that are the roots, the sort of the heartbeat, where you try to find the essence of what's going on harmonically and enhance it, with bass notes. Then after that, our bands took off and did rather well on the circuit. It was very ego gratifying because in the high schools, they would always publish a little card-sized calendar of the monthly schedule of bands and where they were playing. And so you could see, we're playing at Orlando Youth Center on Friday and Winter Park Youth Center on Saturday.
Cool.
And your friends would, we're going to be there. And this is sort of like, it really was much more important than what was going on in the classroom, this culture.
Yeah, kind of being a rock star in a sense.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
In the beginning, back in those days, there was not that many people who had the gumption to pick up an instrument and put it on and sing and play. It was like kind of uncharted territory. So
I know. I didn't even really have I did not have an understanding that was an option. We didn't have a lot of music in our family, and so that was just something that other people did. Just the way it was for me.
And it was very kind of fortunate for those other people that a lot of people thought that, because the field was not very crowded.
Cool. So then that was through your teens, and then what led you to think about going to Africa? And
a lot happened between my teens and that.
Okay,
first, our band got really good, so when I was in 12th grade, we got a record deal with a company in Nashville, Athena Records.
Jeez.
And we were off and running, and it was so good that...
What was the name of the band?
Covington Tower.
Covington Tower.
Yeah. And we all went to different high schools in the Orlando area, but when we graduated, we decided we'd all go to the same college so we could keep the band together. We went to University of South Florida. And I decided to major in music, in composition, because I was always felt like I was called to be a composer, and that's really my life's work, is composition. And so I went in to the orientation, and they told me they didn't offer a degree in composition because there was no work for composers. And so it would make no sense to offer a degree in composition at that point, And a man named Hilton Jones, who was a brand new teacher at the university, who was teaching composition there, even though it wasn't offered as a major, he heard me and he took me aside and he said, "Hey, come with me. There's going to be a degree in composition within the next few years. I'm going to create a program, and you can be the first student in the program."
Nice.
I said, "Okay, great." So I took, instead of taking the basic studies courses, he just gave me all directed study courses. Do this, theory, this, counterpoint, this.
So you were having a blast in college.
Yeah. The first 2 years I didn't do anything but just directed study courses directed at composition. And then when the degree was introduced, I was right in schedule to graduate in 2 years. And so I ganged up on all my basic studies, did them all in 1 year. And I got really good grades, so they gave me a graduate fellowship where they paid for my master's. So I got my room and board and tuition all paid for to get my master's in composition after all that. And this teacher, Hilton Jones, was quite a genius. He built the first real electronic music studio in Florida. He got a $200,000 grant to buy gear. He bought a bunch of Moog 10s and Buchla synthesizers, and he got a space at the university, and then he put me in charge of the studio and gave me the keys.
That was some new kind of equipment, right? New stuff.
Yeah. The Moog 10 was the hottest thing, yeah. It was before the Moog 15, everything voltage control, patching, so you could create all kinds of sounds, just things out of this world. Yeah, I was actually disappointed when that went away and sort of pre-programmed synthesizers came out, like the ARP, where instead of a patching mechanism with chords where you could have any element of the synthesizer control another element and create all sorts of things you never imagined. Instead, it was just preset, like matrix switches where you could do this to this or this to this, but you didn't have all those options. And I'm like, well, now, what the heck? Now we're making it sound like an instrument. There's already instruments. I thought synthesizers were to go beyond that. So, And ever since then, it seems like synthesizers have sort of de-evolved more and more into that purpose of imitating musical instruments rather than originating sounds that we've never heard before. But anyway, in this composition program, he got grants to bring famous composers in to teach. And he brought John Cage, Lucas Foss, Max Neuhaus, all these heavy people. And I was the only composition student. So I would go pick up John Cage at the airport and bring him home. And then he didn't want to stay in a hotel, so he would stay at my house.
Holy smokes.
I was living with
Steven,
my wife,
that's
Barbara.
Awesome.
I got married when I was really young, and we had a house in an orange grove that was surrounded by nature. And so he came and lived with us there while he was a composer in residence.
Wow.
And the same thing with Lucas Foss and Max Neuhaus, the guy who wrote Water Whistle, incredible avant-garde piece. So anyway, I was studying with all these guys, and it was very mind-expanding, to say the least, to have them all to myself and me all to themselves, And so I started getting into this really avant-garde way of thinking about music and composing music that was, really unexpected and I think kind of beautiful and really covering new ground, Like, for example, one of Max Neuhaus's pieces called Water Whistle, which I mentioned, he took an Olympic-sized indoor swimming pool and heated it to about 80 degrees. And then he ran a garden hose from one end of the swimming pool to the other. And attached to the garden hose were about 50 little quarter-inch clear plastic hoses that fed off the garden hose. And attached to each of those was a whistle, like the regular whistle, like a coach's whistle that you blow through. And there was a funnel on that little tube that the whistle was attached to. So the tube came out, went through the funnel, which was with the big side facing the whistle, and then the whistle. And so with 50 of these whistles all tuned to different pitches, he would then run water through the hose. And it would go through the hose and out the little smaller hoses and through the whistles. And the force of the water made those smaller hoses move like snakes. They wiggled around. And the whistle works exactly the same as it does in the air if you blow water through it when you're underwater. Yeah, like if you take a mouthful of water and put a coach's whistle in your mouth and blow it underwater, it sounds just the same, only much clearer.
Wow, I'm going to have to try that.
Yeah, so Max's piece, which was an avant-garde piece, the audience came in their bathing suits, jumped in the pool, and then did dead man's floats, where they just held their breath and just floated under the surface and heard all these notes that were constantly changing because the position of the whistles were changing because of the funnels and the little threads they run. So you just heard this beautiful sound of all these notes changing, chords changing. That's the kind of avant-garde pieces we were doing back then.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. And just before I get to what got me away from that and made me want to go to Africa, I want to tell you just a couple of quick anecdotes about John Cage. One time I brought
John Cage, wow.
Yeah. So one time I brought my bandmates to a concert that John Cage was doing with Gordon Muma and another man. And it was beautiful. And anyway, after the concert, our keyboard player, a guy named Don Hall, was so moved, he was moved to tears. He was totally set free. And he went to John and asked him, he said, "Mr. Cage, when I listen to your music and I listen to you talk, I start hearing everything as music. The crickets, the birds, the ambient noises in my head, it all just becomes music for me." And he was going on, and John looked at him and said, "Maybe you should see a doctor."
That wasn't exactly what I was expecting him to say.
It wasn't what Don was expecting either. He went away all confused, and then later on John looked at me and he said, "Well, actually, I meant something more like a guru. Like I meant he was ready to take it further."
A witch doctor.
Yeah, but he said a doctor.
Wow,
he was
that's funny.
really funny. John he would always make you laugh, and he was always laughing himself. He was Very, very funny. Anyway, what happened was that whole avant-garde music became so big and so popular that there became a wake to that pioneering thread. And like whenever there's a wake in music, like whether it's copying, rock songs from the 60s or copying jazz songs from the 40s, a lot of that music that comes out in the wake is not quite as good.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of following along. And in the case of the avant-garde music, it became really bad in some cases. Like I went to one concert where a guy put blank manuscript paper on a music stand and then took an automated pellet gun, sort of like a rifle with pellets, and just blew holes in the sheet music. And the audience applauded, And I thought, okay, what are we doing here? This is just all about shock value now. We're not talking about music anymore.
Yeah.
They've missed the point. And at that point, I remembered how when I was a little kid, and there would be some documentary about Africa that would come on TV. My parents would be downstairs watching it, and when the drumming would start to happen, I would get this I'll try to describe it. It was an indescribable feeling. It felt like I was carrying planets in the palms of my hands. The weight was just unbearable. It was like, I'd hear this music and I'd feel this weight in the palm of my hands that was like, it would make me throw up and make me sick and just make me, go into a bad state. And I would run up to my bedroom, and the only way I could relieve it would be to shut the door and put pillows on my lap and just play drums on the pillows in a frenzy. And then I could get over that incredibly uncomfortable feeling that I had this weight in my hands.
You're very sensitive to music and rhythm.
Yeah, it pervaded my body. It almost felt like it was going to kill me if I didn't do that. And so I felt very guilty about it. I would make sure that no one could ever hear me because I felt like there was something wrong about what I was doing. It felt like insanity, But anyway, at that moment when I noticed the avant-garde music had kind of gone off its rails, I remembered how much I loved African music, and I decided to go to Africa and get back into playing music where it's just sounds that you make and things that people respond to without having to over-conceptualize about it.
Did you have some friends or how did you decide where to go? Or
Yeah, no, I didn't have any friends. And at that time, like nowadays, travel is ubiquitous all over the globe. In 1971, Africa was an unknown quantity. If you looked up, traveling in Africa, you wouldn't find anything. No books, nothing to tell you about it. Only things that would tell you don't do it. Don't go there.
Yeah,
I
remember
dangerous.
60s, 70s, a lot of people hadn't been on a plane before. I don't remember when I first was on a plane. You're right, it was a completely new thing in a way for a lot of people.
Yeah, and in West Africa, all those countries had just gotten their independence a couple of decades earlier, so things were very tumultuous and dangerous, and there were horrible stories about it, things that happened to people who went there. Anyway, that just attracted me all the more. So we went without knowing where we were going. Barbara and I first got a cheap flight to Iceland, where I worked. She worked in a fish factory in a little town called Flateyri, and I worked on the boats, not going out to sea, but unloading the fish after they came back in the fish factory. Wow. We did that for a few months, and then we made our way to England, where I made my living busking in the tubes in England on flute, because when I was in college, flute was my major instrument. I was still playing electric bass, but flute was my major instrument. And as part of being a composition major, I had to study all the instruments of the orchestra and take a couple of quarters of each one so I'd know how they worked and know how to write for them and everything. But anyway, so we were living in London, and I was busking in the tubes and making really good money because I was playing like classical music in these beautiful resonating tubes, and people appreciated it. So sometimes I could make 11 pounds in a day, whereas on the market, if I went out for a job, I remember looking at jobs where they'd pay me £7 a week to unload trucks. So,
sounds like a good choice he made there.
Yeah. So we made enough money there to make it to Germany, and then we lived in Germany for about 6 months working in a hotel in Bavaria. And then we made enough money there to get to Spain, and we crossed over at Ceuta into Gibraltar. And we had saved enough money for boat passage to Casablanca. But when we got to Casablanca, we were pretty much broke. I think we had $5 or $10 on us, So this is a very unplanned trip that could have gone horribly wrong. But I think the thing that saved me was I had my outrageously wonderful and beautiful wife, Barbara, with me, who was about 23 years old, and everywhere we went, doors just opened for us. And I found out later, because we were a couple, we were non-threatening. If I had been there by myself in Africa, things wouldn't have been so open. But because we were a balanced molecule, a man and a woman, and because she was so magnificently charismatic, everywhere we went, people would fight over who would get to take us into their homes and feed us. We walk into a village, and people would come at us from all sides and pulling on our arms. No, me, and they want to pull us to their house. And when we'd go, all they'd want to do is just give us food and a place to sleep with nothing asked of us. Because in West Africa, strangers were traditionally seen as a sign of good luck.
This sounds like everybody's dream to do.
It was.
You're living the dream for sure.
But we didn't know it was there. So we had this cordiality that allowed us to travel throughout West Africa without having any money. The only time we needed money was when we needed to make long trips, and then I forget how we got it, but we'd get some and pay a truck driver, and he'd lock us up in the back of his truck and take us where we needed to go. They called them lorries, and they had lorry parks where anybody who was driving somewhere. Oh, you know about this?
No, I just heard the name, word lorry. That's all.
They call them in England.
Yeah.
And you remember the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy? How
yes.
Reality became extremely distorted when there was only one of a certain object, i.e. the Coke bottle. Well, the same thing happened with these lorry drivers. Because there were very few vehicles, they had to go against the grain of the family of man that they lived in, which was a communal family where everything was shared. And instead they had to say, no, that's my truck and you can't have it. And so horrible things would happen psychologically.
It was sort of a power, too, to have those trucks.
Yeah. But it was also the destruction of their hunter-gatherer sharing way of life, just like in the movie, The Gods Must Be Crazy. So the lorry drivers became ruthless, ostracized from society, and all about making money. So what they would do, they would park their trucks. Sometimes they had windows, sometimes they didn't. They'd park them in a central part of the village. And then people who needed to travel there would pay them their francs and get on the truck. And then they'd lock the door. And they'd wait till more people came and open it and put more people in and lock the door. And sometimes it would take days to fill the truck. So if you were one of the first people to get on, you'd sit in this truck, unable to get out, unable to go out to go to the bathroom. They treated you exactly like as if you were a piece of inanimate cargo.
Jeez. I mean, like no bathroom in the truck.
No, you just go right there. And nothing to eat. They didn't really care if you lived or died because they had your money. So sometimes, like if it was a thing that had seats in it, like a bus of some sort, you'd get a seat, and then there'd be people who'd come and sit on your lap, and then people who'd sit on their lap, and then they'd shove some little kids through the window to lay across their laps. And it was all full that they'd take off. And I remember one time, I think we were going from Dakar to Ouagadougou. They did this, and no sooner did the truck get full, they took off and drove about 10 minutes and then parked for the night at their house. And the drivers went in and slept and left us all locked in the vehicle all night. And there were sick people, people throwing up, people vomiting, and all this disease was transmitted to everyone. And it was at that moment that I learned the meaning of patience. Because I looked at this one kid in this particular truck that was so miserable. And this kid was sitting there sick, all kinds of things coming out of his orifices. And whenever I'd look at him, he'd look back at me and give me the biggest smile. Oh. And it didn't matter. Like we tend to think, or I used to think of patience as something that could have a limit. Like my patience has gone so far. Like, I've done the best I can take no more. At that moment, I realized that isn't patience. Patience is what that kid was doing, which was eternal. No matter what happened, he knew somehow at that young age that he could control how he reacted to the situation. He didn't have to cry. He could laugh and he could smile. It was his freedom. And so that's where I learned about patience. To decide
how to react.
Yeah. So anyway, we...
How did you decide to go to which country? Did you go and live in a number of countries after you kind of got to the destination point? Or?
Yeah. Senegal was easy because we could get there by boat, and it was the northernmost point of West Africa. At that point, we didn't travel across the Sahara. We went by boat. So, the Sahara is about 3,000 miles wide and about almost 6,000 miles long, and it's a barrier between North Africa and West Africa. And the oceans are the other barrier. So it produced a culture of scarcity in West Africa in the 1970s, where there were no European goods to speak of, just like there were barely any cars or trucks. And everything was, grown and raised there, and that's what the people lived off of. But wherever European goods were imported, they may be some sort of a little place that had some cans of peas or cans of beans. It'd be like the equivalent of $20 for a can of peas. And if you wanted to buy one of those trucks down there, it'd be like the equivalent of maybe $50,000.
Jeez.
Because once the colonial powers had stopped extracting the resources, they left. And then they left them isolated from the world. And it's too far to ship things down across the Sahara or down around the Atlantic, especially when these people had no translatable currency. There was no reason to do trade. So there was this culture of extreme scarcity of everything except that which was grown and produced right there, instruments included. I know now when you think of Africa, you think of high life music and Fela Kuti and all this stuff, and there was none of that there in the 70s. Well, actually, in Accra, the high life movement was starting, and people had guitars. There were some guitars that got down there, and in the capital city of Ghana, you could actually hear the birth of high life. But as soon as you went out of Accra, it was as different as the scenes in The Gods Must Be Crazy out there were from Nairobi, which was also happening at the same time that scene was happening. Just go 50 miles outside of town, and you were back in the hunter-gatherer days, and people lived like they had lived for thousands and thousands of years.
And you spent a lot of time in those villages and sort of making music with them, learning. I mean, I find the stories that I've heard about that fascinating.
Yeah. Well, at first, I know you've heard this story before, but it's pretty relevant. My first quest was to buy an instrument. I thought I need to purchase an instrument so I can learn how to play. And when I asked people about that, they looked at me like as if I was crazy, evil, madman. Who would suggest such a thing? To trade something for an instrument? You don't do that. Later on I found out that was because in the traditional hunter-gatherer culture where music evolved, instruments were seen as living beings that musicians brought to life in the same way that some force brought the musician to life in this endless circle of the continuance of life. And so they didn't buy and sell instruments. Instead, they named them and, wrapped them up and put them to bed at night and treated them like their babies, because it was a very real way of seeing, there it is sitting there. There's that drum sitting there doing nothing. I pick it up, I play it. It becomes animate, and whoa, doesn't that remind me of something, There I was, nothing, didn't exist, something picked me up and made me animate, This is a heavy situation, this is profound. These are not objects that you would buy or sell,
Yeah. So, and it sounds like music was just a fundamental part of everyday life.
It nourished every phase of life. Since they had no other media, no recording devices, no radio stations, there was music for all the different work chores, harvesting, making food, pounding millet, music for all the ceremonies, births, deaths, graduations, debutante, the equivalent of a debutante dance where the women come out and show themselves. And music was everywhere, and it was alive and crazy, beautiful, and totally unself-conscious. They had never heard recorded music or heard themselves recorded. So it was a beautiful, vibrant culture where music was a verb and everyone did it. Some people got more talented, had a natural affinity. Other people just kept sticking to singing songs while they were pounding their millet, but music was everywhere. And I see culture now as this abomination where we've created this rarefied atmosphere from the general public and said, only people who practice and play good can be musicians.
Yeah.
They're out here, and you are all back here in the mass of humanity. You can listen to them and buy their records, and do that stuff. To me, that's the ultimate tragedy of society and a capitalist culture, is that we did that to music. We created it as a rarefied atmosphere.
Yeah, you were mentioning that people didn't really have money. I mean, they shared things, and just the whole "gods must be crazy" type. It's just in some ways, it's hard to imagine us who've become so separate from that's even really possible. And a lot of the Western Europeans and people look at those people as savages, but it's kind of the reverse, isn't it?
It's the total reverse.
Yeah.
For one thing, there was no danger. Every place we went, like I said, we were welcomed as family members. Anything that we owned, we could set down on the ground and we'd know it'd be there the next morning because we were all brothers and sisters, and no one would think of taking, at that point, no one would think of taking our possessions, because no more than you would think of stealing from your brother or something. I'm not talking about unique things, but if we had a bag of peanuts and a couple of oranges, we could set it down. We wouldn't have to worry about somebody eating it because it'd be like you stealing from your brother,
Yeah.
So there was no danger at all. Instead, we were just loved and taken care of in that family of man thing, because we were part of the group.
And what was their religion? Sort of. I mean, what was their guiding principle of life?
Okay, well, I've actually done a lot of reading about that. I can quote you some phrases. The African religions were not written down. They were not something that you memorized or learned precepts. They were something that you felt. And so that's why in ancient Africa, you won't find any writings about religions. It's before religion. Actually, like all religion, Buddhism didn't get tagged as Buddhism until 1880. Before that, the people just thought they were doing what was the right thing to do. It was a European who gave it a name and called it a religion. So there weren't written, documented religions. And the Africans, once they found out about those things, they were quite proud to say, our religion lives inside of us, not in books. Now, there had been plenty of missionaries, and people had been persuaded to this and that side of European religions. But at the time I was there, the traditional way of doing things always still persisted, and there were no religions per se, other than a sanctity and a respect for all things that breathe and live and are. That includes what we call inanimate objects.
Yeah.
The Europeans labeled that way of looking at things as animism. And they said, the Africans believe that there are spirits in the trees and spirits in the rocks with a will and a volition identical to man's. And they treat the rocks and the trees that way and their instruments that way. And that's how they, from their lens, they saw it. So they called it animism. Now, quantum physics has shown us that they were exactly right.
Yes, yeah. That's an interesting way to put it. So could you talk a little bit about some of the musical experiences that you did have there?
Mm-hmm. First of all, there's a little incongruity because I told you there was no currency in these villages. And then I think at my talk last night I mentioned how at one moment when I was made into a lead drummer and shoved out in front of the group, people threw money at us. Okay, well that happened in Niamey, the capital of Niger. And there they were using something called the CFA, which was an African franc based on the French franc. And so they did have money there, but not out in the rural areas. There they would trade things, or salt a lot of times was traded. So it was like different planets, just like in the movie Gods Must Be Crazy. Nairobi was a completely different planet from where all the action took place, but they were actually very close together. So anyway, once I realized how they felt about instruments, I was lucky enough to find an abandoned drum shell that was cracked. And I got some hide and stretched over it and made it so it would make a sound. And then I met a shoemaker from Ghana who could translate from English to Jerma, D-J-E-R-M-A, which was the language there in Niger. And I had heard this group that was led by a master drummer named Issa Hamani, and I asked him to tell Issa that I wanted to learn to play the drum. And so he did, and Issa looked like, well, how would that be possible? He's not part of our universe. I mean, look at him. He's in a different universe. He's irrelevant. He's a ghost. He could never understand what we're doing here. And so I guess out of the graciousness of Issa's heart, he played me a rhythm to see if I could repeat it, and I did. Since I knew about rhythms, I had studied music, and he was really, really surprised, because I even got the subtleties of the pitch changes as best I could. And so he started thinking, he thought, wow, I can work with this guy. And so he taught me phrases, short phrases that were the punchlines of jokes. And then he would take me all over Niamey, where he would deliver the setup and then point to me and I'd deliver the punchline, and people would laugh their asses off and throw money at us. And the way that was possible was because in most African languages, the inflection for any given word is constant. You know, you can say, I like peanut butter. Or you can say, I like peanut butter. Or you can say, I like peanut butter. There's a million ways we change our inflections. But in the African languages, it was constant for a given word. So butter would always be a word that went da-da, and tree would always be something bo-da-dee-da. So since you could change pitch on this talking drum, you could go boo-doo-doo-doo, doo-doo, and people would know you were saying tree butter. And if any two words duplicated their melodic content, they would get around that by elaborating. So if, say, the word for butter was the pitch change in the word for butter was the same as the pitch change in the word for frog, they would say the tree butter that doesn't hop. And so they were able to speak literally, and they would tell the news
with the sounds.
Yeah, with the talking drum. Boom, 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 boom. That means I am speaking. Ghana, listen. That's how they'd start radio broadcasts when they were in the cities, you know, with those boom, 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 boom. I'm speaking. Boom, 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 boom. Ghana, listen. And everyone understood perfectly. And like for thousands of years, they had been telling the news and telling jokes and telling stories with these things. I mean, if you can picture a bunch of people sitting around on the ground and one guy playing a drum, and they're all like listening, and he's telling them a story, and
to the radio,
and they understand every word.
Wow.
Yeah, so what Issa would do, he'd make a joke where he'd say something on his drum to the effect of, look at this skinny little scrawny white kid with that weird hair. Where did he come from? Could you imagine him understanding what I'm saying? And then he'd point to me and I'd play a rhythm that would say, you bet your ass I know every word you're saying. And they would go, wow. And so I became the sensation of Niamey. I was called Monsieur Dondo. And when we'd do this, hundreds of people would gather around in a big donut.
And you're the only white person.
Well, me and Barbara.
You and Barbara, yeah.
Well, actually, in Niamey, there was a few other white people, but outside of Niamey, none. So much so that a lot of villages we would go to, the first thing that would happen was they'd see us and they'd run for the hills. All the young people would run for the hills, like scared shitless. And then an older person who had seen white people before would gather him up and explain, no, really, he's okay. Let me tell you about him. He's this, he's that. And then the kids would all come up and be hugging us and touching us and examining the buttons on our shirts and fighting over who would get to take us home so we'd be their good luck charm. And within an hour or so of them running from us, we'd find ourselves taking a nap on the communal bed, which every village had a big round bed, maybe 30 feet in diameter, made out of logs where everyone would sleep in the daytime, you know. And so you'd be sleeping on this bed and you look over and here's this little African kid staring back at you, smiling and kissing you and hugging you, who just an hour away was in mortal fear of you.
It's amazing.
Yeah, that was amazing. So anyway, after I did well with being the comedian of the drum in Niamey, then he decided that he would go ahead and teach me to play. And so I started learning rhythms. And basically what makes a master drummer is a large library of memorized rhythms, maybe about 500 or so patterns.
Wow.
And when you remember all 500 patterns, that you've accumulated
Sounds
over
like
your life.
the ragas or something.
Yeah. They called them master drummers at that point. So since I had musical training and I could picture these rhythms written down, it was much easier for me to memorize them. And so I took off and I was learning them really fast. And give me another one, I'd write it down, and my buddies in the band would look at what I was writing like, what is that, I'd say, this is the analog of what you're playing. Look, dum, kum, kum, ka-dum, kum, kum. And I never taught it to him because I didn't speak Jerma well enough, but that allowed me to, learn the rhythms so that I could actually be part of the group and perform with them. But for the privilege of doing that, I had to turn over all of my worldly possessions, which wasn't very much at that point, a little telescope and a couple of other items. But in exchange for that, I was made into a griot. I joined their griot group. And griots were the hereditary musicians, the ones who played the ceremonies and things.
The storytellers, too.
Right, yeah. And it was a very serious gig, because griots could be killed for making mistakes in their reciting of history. There was a death penalty. Or if they felt the griot was redeemable, they may inflict that penalty on a family member.
Yikes.
And so when they would go to tell the history and stuff, it was very serious business, and they were oftentimes looking scared to make sure they got it right, because that was the only integrity they had, was the stories, the oral histories told by the griots. And they were held highly accountable. And of course, there was no law enforcement, there was no police, it was all community. And the ugly side of that view into our hunter-gatherer past is that they could be extremely vicious when somebody did something wrong. Like I remember one time I was in a little village in a market, and all of a sudden everybody around me started picking up sticks, and they chased after this guy, and they were ready to beat him to death. And it was because he had stolen something that he wasn't supposed to steal from someone who was selling something in the market or trading something in the market. And at that moment, everybody became the policeman, and everybody wanted to get their licks in. And if he didn't escape, he could very well be beaten to death.
Yeah, wow.
You know, so you have this peaceful society where everyone's sharing everything and getting along, and it's just like you think you're in heaven, and then you see what happens when somebody goes against the society. It wasn't like they get a fine or a slap on the wrist or a reprimand or they go to jail. No, the people say this is against what we're all about, and they would go viciously after that person.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. One of the things that you were talking about, and I might ask you if you could say a little bit about again, is the healing, because we talk about. I mean, and here at Wooten Woods, we're talking about all kinds of different things, you know, and the healing aspects of music, and there's music therapists, and you feel better when you ride in when you turn the radio on in your car, and I mean all those kinds of things. But that's a little different than I think what you were talking about with the healing of someone in one of these villages who was sick or had some kind of a malady.
Yeah, I actually only experienced what we could refer to as medicinal music in the middle of the Sahara with the Tuaregs, Taureg, the desert nomads. They had a real culture of music for the purpose of healing, and certain kinds of music they wouldn't ever play unless there was someone to be healed. This happened when we were leaving West Africa after about 2.5 years, and we decided to cross the Sahara from northern Niger up into Algeria. And so we were there with the Tuaregs. It wasn't really a village. It was more like encampments where they'd have their tents and their camels, and maybe it might be near an oasis or not. But anyway, I had a little battery-powered reel-to-reel recorder, 5-inch tape, which was kind of the poor man's Nagra of the day. It was used for reporters and things, but it was battery-powered. And in the cities at that time, that was one thing you could get, was size D flashlight batteries. Actually, all of these countries made their own. Like you could get Ghanaian batteries and Senegalese batteries. So I was able to operate that machine. And so we were sitting there with the Tuaregs, and we didn't speak any of their language, so they were giving us tea and welcoming us. And I'd turn on my tape recorder and record them, and then I'd stop it, and then I'd play it back. And they were like, whoa! And they'd hear their voices back for the first time, And then all of a sudden, gears start to turn. They say, wait a minute, we could hear our music, But wait a minute, nobody's sick. We can't play if nobody's sick. And they'd say, wait a minute, so-and-so over there in this village has a really bad fever. Go get her quick, and gather up Bill and everybody else, and we're going to play, And so then they played this music, Tuareg medicinal music, which you can actually hear. After I got back, I took my field recordings, and Nonesuch released 2 albums in their Explorer series that, if I can brag, went on to be the best-selling albums of the entire Nonesuch Explorer series. Right. I think because they were gleaned from about 30 hours of music from many, many different cultures. I took the very, very best 2 albums worth and then sent it to Nonesuch, and they signed me up right away. And so you can actually go to Nonesuch. The first album was called Africa, drum chant and instrumental music, recorded by Stephen Jay. And the second album was called Ghana, Ancient Ceremonies, Songs and Dances. And those aren't available on CD or records anymore, but you can still download them. So if you go to nonesuch.com, you can maybe preview that Tuareg chant that I'm talking about, which consisted of people clapping their hands in slowed down harmonic intervals, like the fifth. Which we'll get to later.
Yeah.
And then other people beating on pots and calabashes, and then people doing sort of drone chants. And then a medium, or a woman that was explained to me as some kind of a medium, went into a trance and then sang a melodic line on top. Meanwhile, on top of all this, the sick person would dance like they were running in place, like flailing their arms and legs, which you could say they were basically sweating out a fever, because they would do this furiously and then they would get cured, you know. And there's a lot more to it than that. I think a whole lot of what Victor talks about with the power of intentionality and the vibrations working to heal that person because they were intending to heal that person, but that kind of stuff's pretty hard to talk about. But there it was, medicinal music, healing the sick in the middle of the desert.
Well, you mentioned also recording some of these people who had never heard that. It reminds me of, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? You know, these guys are going around, hey, you can get some money from singing in a can.
Yeah.
And I talked with, because I got into the Lomax recordings, Alan and John Lomax recordings, particularly the southern United States, the Field Hollers.
On Folkways, right?
Yeah, the Arhulis and spirituals and all these things. There was, I think, a perspective. I talked with this guy who was at the Library of Congress. He said, well, you know, there was people were playing music, and particularly the Africans, you know, they put them through real slavery, and it was very problematic, but they couldn't really take the music out of them. And they had, as Alan Lomax said, it's kind of the glorious humanity to sing. But he said, you know, when people could hear what music sounded like, then they started to think, oh, well, that's how it's supposed to be, and it's not the way that I would play it. And it kind of took it out of the common, away from the common people in a sense.
Once they could hold a mirror up to it and see it back, that is the tape recorder, they did what all musicians do, which is to say, hey, I can do that better, and clean it up, make it more in the pocket, make it more in tune, less rough edges.
And then more people think, oh, I can't do it the right way.
Yeah, because it started to create that rarefied atmosphere, which
as you mentioned.
I was there with my tape recorder, I was doing that to them. I was holding up the mirror for the first time in their lives. And many years later, now they don't sound the same because they've recorded themselves and heard themselves, and they play what we would say are better. Yeah. But it's a whole different animal. It doesn't sound the same as it did on those early Nonesuch recordings.
I'm sure same with the church, the black churches in the South versus, today. That was some wild stuff. Could we talk a little bit about the rhythm and pitch that you and your sons have been working on, because it's
this is a perfect time.
Yeah, it's a fascinating perspective to have that I don't think a lot of people have.
Okay. Well, when I was in college, there was a device made by Delta Lab. It was the DL4. It was one of the first digital delays made, and it had an infinite capture switch on it, where you could take the thing that had been captured in the delay module and just flick the switch, and then it would repeat. So if you hit a fifth on a piano, a C and a G, you'd hit that chord, then you hit the capture switch, and it'd keep playing that dong, 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 dong. Uh-huh. And the amazing thing about the DL4 was it also had an octave switch that had like 16 increments of octaves. And so I bumped that octave switch down so it goes ding, ding, dong, dong,
yeah.
And for the first time in my life, I heard the rhythm of a major fifth, which is... So I took that C and that G and slowed it down about 7 octaves, and I heard this. And I thought, holy crap, harmonic intervals each have their own signature rhythm. I tried it with a fourth. It was... This is easy to understand if you just think what we're listening to is the peaks of the waveforms after they've been dropped down a sufficient number of octaves to turn cycles per second into beats per minute. It's easy to understand. A unison would be, an octave would be, and then the next perfect interval, the fourth, and then the fifth. And when you start getting into thirds and sixths, the rhythms become much more complex. But anyway, I had discovered that, or I should say...
It's a long time ago then.
Yeah. I discovered that when I was in college, and so I wrote a big paper about it called The Theory of Harmonic Rhythm. And it's still on my website at stephenjay.com, stephenjay.com, under articles called The Theory of Harmonic Rhythm. And it delineates all the rhythms for all the different harmonic intervals, which was cool. Anyway, getting back to Africa, what I noticed there was that they would play their music in groups of rhythmic patterns in different meters. Like a drum song might start off with a pattern in 6/8, followed by 2/4, followed by 3/4, 4/4, 3/8, 4/4. And so I listened to these things, and I was shocked because they were the same patterns that I heard in my experimentation with the rhythm inside of harmony. When you'd hold down a complex chord, like say a minor ninth chord or something, instead of it just being one pattern, it was a group of patterns that cycled. Like, and then it would repeat. And I was like,
blown away.
How did they know this without having a microscope?
Without having a slow downer or something.
Like an audio microscope to be able to see this. So when I got back to the United States, I really got heavy into the study of this, and sure enough, they were playing chords in these drum songs, beautiful, beautiful, rich chords. You can think of it as harmony is ultra-fast rhythm, separated by a chasm of 7 octaves, which is hard to imagine, actually.
Yeah.
You can say it, but it's hard to conceive of. And rhythm is ultra-low harmony. It exists wherever you have 2 constant frequencies, working off of each other. Anyway, so since when you hear these rhythms, they all come around to repeating themselves at the cycle point where the waveform completes. So if you have a waveform that has, say, 6 cycles in it against a waveform that has 4 cycles in it, it sounds like it repeats when the cycles match up at the end of a lowest common denominator journey. And that makes a rhythm that's a palindrome. So all of the harmonic rhythms, all of the rhythms that are contained in all of the harmonic intervals are palindromes. They're mirror images of themselves from front to back. Anyway, so really got into this stuff. It was so inspiring compositionally because it's not only rhythmic, it's also melodic. If you apply the pitches to those rhythms, there's a melody there too. Like, for example, a minor chord, say a C and an E flat and a G, produces a rhythm that, if you just look at the points of attack, it goes bum bada bum 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 badum 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 bum badum badum bum bum badum bum 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 badum, and then it repeats bum 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 badum 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 bum 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 badum bum bum badum bum 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 badum. Palindrome rhythm. But if you listen to it with the pitches, the C and the E flat and the G, it creates this melody that goes bum badum bum 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 badum bum bum badum bum 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 badum bum bum badum bum 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 badum.
Wow.
Then it repeats. That's 5 bars of 6/8 that it takes to have one cycle of a minor chord express itself. And so I started composing music that way, harvesting these rhythms that are inside of harmony. And some of them, like if you take the second inversion of that same minor chord, weird things happen. That pattern goes like this. It's much longer. It goes bump. And then it repeats. And that's just one cycle of all those composite ratios. What a cool melody.
It's so fascinating, and I have to admit that I am not 100% able to understand all of it. But one thing that I think that I am appreciating from it is that if you speed all those frequencies up, you end up getting light somehow, right? I mean,
Getting what?
Light. I mean, if you
Light?
you take
You mean
rhythm to harmony to pitch, and if
exactly?
you keep speeding it up, you get light. And I guess I don't know what happens when you slow it down so much. Do you get rocks?
Well, that's another fascinating area of analogizing to work with that I've hoped to see somebody who's into the visual arts explore the connections between color and shape, because I think they may be the same analogous relationships between harmony and rhythm.
It's so, oh my God, it's just
like what
so
we're
amazing.
talking about basically is the unified field theory of music. You know, E equals MC squared, the analogy between energy and mass. Here we have, if harmony is H and rhythm is R, we have H equals R dropped 7 octaves, approximately, depending on the original pitch. Or R equals H raised 7 octaves. So it's the same thing that Einstein saw and felt. And, he felt it so strongly that even when it was unprovable, he theorized about it, and later on it was proven. So I think the same thing is true with harmonic rhythm. Of course, in some cases it's absolutely flesh and bones proven, like the fact that that chord that I just sang for you is a minor chord proves that there is such a thing as minor and major rhythms. And if you talk to a musician or talk to your drummer and say, hey, play me that beat in a minor key, he'd think you didn't know anything about music. But this is the future of music. This whole research proves that there are minor rhythms and major rhythms. Like, for example, the major chord, when you take a C and an E and a G, that rhythm is just dun it's like 2 measures of 6/8 instead of 5, the minor chord. And likewise, the minor chord feels deeper and more meaningful and takes you longer to linger on than a major chord. You get in more major chord instantly because it actually cycles faster. And just to make sure you're really clear, what we're talking about is listening to the beat frequencies of slowed down frequencies. So just like we said, if a C is that actually represents a very low C, that and when you put the G on top of it, which is that ratio of a fifth is 3/2, so it's basically a triplet. You lower that C down to an F for a fourth, and you get. So I think that there's no more thorough way of describing a harmonic interval than by describing its inner harmonic rhythm. It's much more descriptive than just saying it's this many semitones apart. That's just a number, could mean anything. But when you realize that a major seventh, a tritone, a third, all have these distinctive rhythms, then it starts to shed light on the mystery of why harmonic intervals each evoke such different emotions in us. An octave just sits there. A fifth makes you feel solid. A third, if it's major, is a kind of a...
It's affecting your own frequencies, basically.
Yeah.
Affecting your own internal rhythmic, whatever it is.
Maybe so.
It's just fascinating, but I do want to go back to one thing that we didn't talk about, but in this discussion, the way I think about it, I've seen those studies where they put the sand on the tone generators and they change the frequency, and the sand goes into these various shapes, and so and also from the conversation I had with Michael out here a year ago, sitting in the exact same place, and he mentioned the book Nada Brahma, The World is Sound, which could also be translated in Indian, I think, into everything in the universe is created from sound. It begins to make me think, these superficial kind of differences that we think there are not there aren't really those differences. And if you're looking for commonalities and a way to, kind of expand your understanding of what really is, it's helpful. But when you talk about the way that the Africans thought about music as an entity, it even makes it more I don't know if it's clear or understandable or whatever, that, that there's a lot of things going on that we don't really appreciate, but that do demonstrate how kind of all equivalent we are in a sense. But could you talk a little bit about the how they've thought of music? And Victor talks about this, and I think you have too, about you feel like music is playing you.
Mm-hmm. Well, most musicians have that feeling, and
Yeah.
you do too. Yeah, one thing I didn't mention, along with the instruments being alive, they also felt that music itself was a life form, not an art form, gigantic, spanning the entire universe and all known time, that lives and needs musicians to help it live, at least in the audio realm, and uses those musicians the same way that a person uses the bacteria in their stomach or the dirt that they're walking on. It supports the larger being. So if you could imagine, like a musician, he's doing his work and then he gets a calling, he feels like, I need to go play. That's music needing him, just like we need the bacteria in our stomachs. Now you can imagine in the Western world, where music has been turned into a commodity that you buy and sell,
Yes.
that little bacteria in your stomach taking credit for creating you and saying, look how talented I am. I've created this big, glorious human being. No. You're just a tiny little part of what sustains it.
Yeah.
Just like we are just a tiny little part of what sustains music, And so there was that view. Music is a life form, not an art form. And it's on a level, an unimaginably higher level than we are. Just as unimaginable as it is for the bacteria to know what it's inside of.
Well, it kind of makes more sense to me to think of, the driving life force as music and vibration and sound, rather than some dude with gray hair up in the clouds shooting thunderbolts down at us. I mean,
all analogies are good. Even that one. I recently read a book by Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sander called Surfaces and Essences that postulates that no human being has ever had a thought that wasn't an analogy. Even the letters are an analogy. When I say, oh, you remember something else like oh, and that's how it communicates. So words are analogies, and phrases are analogies, and concepts are analogies, and that's how we understand the world. If you can't have an analogy about something, you can't comprehend it. That's why everything is like something.
because you can't really understand it.
Right. It'd be like Douglas says in his book. Imagine ABC is talking to JKL, and ABC says, hey, I just had an experience that changed me to ABD. Well, JKL is going to translate as, well, yeah, the same thing happened to me. I became JKM. Now, it's not the same thing. Those are totally different letters on the surface, but in the essence, it is the same thing. So that's why the title, Surfaces and Essences. Now imagine if ABC is relating that experience to XYZ. XYZ, well, there is no successive letter that I can change to, so what do? Become XYD? That doesn't fit. Or do I become XYA and go back to the beginning? That's a stretch. It's still not the same experience.
Right.
So making analogies, whether it's saying music is a life form, or instruments are like beings, or there's some bearded god in the sky bigger than us, like a much bigger man with a much longer beard who created us, it's still a useful analogy. But most analogies are what they refer to as naive analogies. And naive analogies are formed and they stick with us. Little kids start forming naive analogies when they're very young. Like an example of that is a baby is taken to the park for the first time in its life, okay, and it only knows one word, mama. And it looks over and it sees a man taking care of a baby or a young child and caring for it and nurturing it and being good to it, and it points at the man and says, mama. That's the first thought. It's an analogy. That guy is doing something analogous to what my mom does.
Yeah.
So that's why I say you can't really pit naive analogies against more accurate analogies, because we're all ingrained with the naive analogies we formed when we were young that create the library of conceptual spaces that we have to be able to relate to the world. And they're all different, like you might have grown up in a culture where there was a certain sort of dangerous animal, like a rattlesnake, and so you have this view of rattlesnakes as being analogous to sickness and pain and suffering, Whereas another person might have grown up in an atmosphere where there's just green tree snakes that never cause any harm. And when he sees the snake, it brings up an analogy of something that's beautiful. That's just a really simple example of how naive analogies affect us. So anyway, that's just to elaborate on what you said about it sounds better than a guy with a long gray beard. At one point, that analogy was the best way to get to the next one.
But that analogy...
being the guy with the long gray beard, no matter how naive it is. You see what I'm saying?
Some way to explain.
Some way to start to explain.
Yeah.
And then you build up more conceptual spaces, create more analogies, and you get better explanations like quantum physics now. It's not only, you say music, or everything is sound and frequency. Well, sound is a very narrow area of frequency, and it consists of harmony and rhythm, lots of different kinds of sounds. But quantum physicists have, of course, shown that it's more probability.
Yes. Right.
And you can measure frequencies of probabilities for sure, but that kind of gets to an even deeper analogy of understanding this world that we live in. That's a far cry from the guy in the long white beard, but it's built on successive, more informed analogies.
Well, it's also fascinating. Let me also get to the question that I like to ask, which, given the conversation, I don't even know if it makes sense sometimes, but you've had this amazing life and experiences, and you've played for a long time with Weird Al in a band, and you've seen the quote power of music in so many different circumstances and ways, and it's really just been kind of your life. What for just other folks? What is that power of music? How do you define it? Think about it, and without even waiting to hear the answer that you have, how can we tap into that? What's the best way for us to kind of understand, appreciate, think of, or move in which direction to help, make a better world, to, deal with some of these things, the capitalistic problems, the religious problems, the division, the warfare, all those things. You've seen a lot of stuff in your life, and I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd have to say we already have tapped into it. I mean, look how much peace and fellowship and brotherly love music has already brought to us,
Yeah.
First, just from bringing people together to dance, to meaningful songs like the one that Joseph Wooten played here before lunch, I mean, it's already doing it in big ways, and in super small ways, too. Like sometimes I'll just be riding along and I'll hear a certain chord in a song and it'll just bring tears to my eyes, just that one chord. It's so beautiful. It's like inescapable beauty. And when you witness something that's so beautiful and so much larger than yourself, it diminishes ego. And then when you diminish ego, you start to worry less about the things that are to come. That is the unknown. And I've heard it said that all fear is fear of the unknown. And so if you say, I've heard it also said that the basic two emotions are fear and love, you can get to love by not fearing the unknown. And music is a sort of a pretty cool example of that, because we don't know how it works. We don't understand why it makes us feel this way, although we're trying to, because that's what we do as human beings. We theorize and form analogies. It still brings us that feeling of more peace, just hearing it. So that on the very basic level. And then I think regarding art forms as a sort of reinventing of the sacred. In the past, sacred things have always served to bring people together, shared beliefs and things that may or may not exist, But if we reinvent the sacred, there's a famous book by that title, and say, music is sacred. It's not a commodity. It's not a way to make, just a way to make money or a way to make people dance. It's a sacred thing that leads us on this incredible journey of mystery that we're just at the beginning of. I think that I can't listen to a moving song without being changed inside and think that I'm a much smaller thing. And when I'm a much smaller thing, I feel like whatever my fears are, they're probably the wrong fears to begin with. So why should I even bother to have them? It's like, it'd be like say a dog is staring at a dog food can when his master's not home and looking at the label and coming up with a theory about where that dog food came from. He's never going to get it right, But he might develop some fear about not having it, and his incorrect, naive theories about where that dog food came from would lead him to fears that are nothing to really be afraid of, One might say, if you want to be afraid, you should be more afraid of this, not that. So when music makes us feel smaller, just like looking up at the universe makes us feel smaller, it makes our fears feel less founded and less correct.
That's important.
So, like if you're afraid of something and then you find out that thing doesn't even exist, why was I wasting my time being afraid of it? You know? And so I think in terms of dispelling fear and embracing the unknown, music and all forms of art, dance, literature, art, visual arts, can go a long ways towards bringing that profound transformation inside of us that helps us to realize that we're not masters of the universe, and all of our thoughts are probably misleading, although helpful, but not something to base a fear on. Like, I'm sure that if there is life after this experience, of life, I'm going to look back at it and just say over and over again, what was I so worried about,
What was I so worried about? Yeah, that's for sure.
It wasn't anything like I pictured. I didn't understand it at all. I had this much knowledge, and I thought I knew what I should be afraid of, But what I really should have been afraid of was that thought of thinking I knew.
Yeah.
So I guess it's also been said, seeing that you don't see is the groovy thing, and that relieves fear because it disqualifies you as an evaluator of what there is to be afraid of.
Yeah, well, I've spent a lot of time studying A Course in Miracles, and that we were talking with Roy Wooten last night and Victor about Ho'oponopono and love and fear and all those things. And, they say there's nothing to fear. I mean, I think you're kind of saying, or that music can help us not fear.
Yeah, I think what I'm saying is that music can help us to distrust our fears.
To distrust our fears.
Yeah, because it's when you trust in that fear and you say, this is a real threat, that guy's really, or this is really, I got to watch out for this, that the fear becomes so intense that it affects your behavior and the words you choose to utter. But if you look at it more like, what the bleep do I know? Another famous movie.
Yes,
then
love that movie.
How could I even be a person who's qualified to judge what to be afraid of? So yeah, it's liberating in that way.
That's so cool. So this may be the last thing that I ask about, but when we start this, that was a
acorn, I bet.
An acorn dropping on the roof of the pavilion here. People are out there at Wooten Woods having a good time. We can hear a little music, and
yeah, it sounds like they're striking up the band there.
It's a fabulous place to be. But Victor asks, why did you come to Spirit of Music Camp? And a lot of people say to get out of my way to be able to play without thinking about it. I understand music more, and all that I get. I'm trying to learn the guitar, But I said, to be part of a community of musicians intentionally creating peace and making the world a better place for everyone and everything. And I kind of feel it's for me, it's sort of an ultimate goal. And I've been wanting to ask you this for a long time. I don't know why. But you've been in a lot of different communities of musicians. How is that possible? I mean, how do we do that? I kind of think the power of music, the power of musicians can be sort of tapped into, or I don't mean like a big NGO, but what's the mindset maybe to have to and you're right. We have a lot of peace. We're better at curing diseases, but we still haven't got all the way. And I know Victor would say there's yin and yang, and you need good for there to be bad and bad for there to be good, and all these things. But do you have thoughts about the idea of how, why, anything, a community of musicians might look like to help make a better world?
Well, I think we have an example of that right here at Vic's Camp. This is the most amazing community of musicians I've ever seen. Everyone is looking for something deep in music. They're not looking for how to get a record deal, how to get famous, how to play faster. They're looking for what is it? What is it about this magical force that can bring us to these higher levels of understanding and alleviate our fears? So I think here we have just the perfect, most amazing example of a musical community I've ever witnessed.
And I guess with communities, you just stick with them, be part of them, trust in them, build them.
And grow together.
Grow
like
together.
We are right now, you and me.
Yeah.
Having thoughts we've never had.
Yeah. That's so amazing. I really appreciate it. I love having these conversations. I'm so grateful that you were able to take the time and we were able to find the time here to talk about this stuff. And I don't know if you have any other final thoughts you might like to say. They're going to ring the bell for dinner in a little while, probably.
Yeah, and we got to get over there and hear this music that's happening.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so, no, I think it pretty much said it all. Music and art is our savior.
There you go. Thank you so much, Stephen J. Really, really appreciate it. And
thank you. It was nice talking to you.
Thanks.
Or talking with you. Sorry.
Yeah. We'll, talk some more, hopefully soon.
All right. I look forward to it.
Okay. Thank you. You've been listening to Planetary Gig Talk, Tales of Music and Magic. I'm your host, Jefferson Glassy, Chief Spiritual Dude of the Planetary Gig Society. We talk with musicians and others about the power of music and how we can use music to help create a better world. Please check out our website, www.planetarygigs.org, for information about some of the organizations promoting music and musicians, resources about the power of music, books, movies, articles, including new research on music and the brain. We welcome your support. The Planetary Gig Society is a Section 501c3 charitable organization, and you can donate on the website. You also can receive a free email signature block demonstrating your support for Planetary Gig Society. Please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Planetary Gigs. And we want to thank fabulous musician and teacher Eric Weinberg of Little Eric Studios for the Planetary Gig Talk music titled Chill Kid, It's Saul. So please check out Planetary Gig Talk on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. Subscribe and hear all the upcoming episodes. Thanks very much.